Thank you, John. Is that working? Brilliant. Thank you so much. It is a real pleasure to be here. I'm very grateful for this invitation. I'm very happy to be able to keep talking about a topic that has kept me busy for quite a while, for a number of years. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the extraordinary work that this foundation has done to promote the arts and the culture of Iran. This is an extremely important task, and it's a sort of joint responsibility of all of us to protect and defend the cultural heritage, everybody's cultural heritage, particularly at this moment in time. So this is a tiny contribution to learning a little bit more about a topic that raised a few eyebrows, but it is indeed a very compelling one. Eccentric and senseless as they may appear to our modern eyes, divinatory practices and associated technologies, by which I mean either the methods developed to perform such practices or the tools to harness their insights and benefits, therefore amulets, talismans, and the like, are inherent part of every cultural experience. Who amongst us hasn't peeked at the horoscope page at the end of a magazine, even if we are just sitting at the hairdresser to wait for our turn, or performed gestures to ward off evil? I don't know, touching wood, hanging things around the house, doing this in Italy, avoiding walking under ladders, and so on and so forth. Alternatively, some of you in the audience may wear jewelry with verses of the Quran as a form of protection, or carry images of saints in their wallets, or more, consult the Divan of Hafez, who was known at his time as Lisan al-Ghaib, or the tongue of the unseen, to make a decision, or maybe prior to an important event. I have never been persuaded that these various behaviors and ideas should be underrated or dismissed, especially when considering the ways in which we, as humans, interact with the world around and above us. And I'd rather see them as integral expressions of the human drive towards the unknown, and as such, as participating in the experience of belief, quote unquote, in the broad sense of the word. The work and research I have done over the past few years has been dedicated to exploring how much acts of prognostication and apotropaic protective devices effectively intertwine with more sanctioned forms of belief, which means canonical religion, often sharing resources, principles, and aspirations. My focus in particular has been the medieval and early modern Islamic world, and the Persianate world plays a hugely important part in this, as the lecture will hopefully make clear. Divination and magic have been traditionally seen as opposite to religion, a paradigm that proved particularly strong in the age of colonial expansion, contributing to authorize occupation and justify conquest. These, in turn, relied on a prevalent post-Enlightenment view, which has tended to measure the progress of civilizations in relation to their ability to graduate, quote unquote, from the former to the latter before reaching scientific awareness. This same rhetoric was eventually taken up by 19th century Islamic revivalist movements, which became responsible for today's widespread bias against popular beliefs and associated practices in the Islamic tradition, including phenomena like the intercession and veneration of saints, or the idea that divination is a total negation of Tawheed, the strict monotheism on which Islam is rooted. A look at the past reveals different attitudes towards these and other practices, however, which enable them to advance in spite of the condemnation expressed in theological and juridical circles. Material evidence in particular, both in the form of everyday objects and luxury items, including works of art, of course, represents one of the most compelling tools to explore the status and significance of divinatory practices in Islamic traditions across different backgrounds, disproving the assumption that they existed as anomalous or localized behaviors, or worse, that they were the prerogative of illiterate masses. The exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, entitled Quarto and Cosmos, The Age of the Great Seljuks, was only the most recent instance to frame the appearance of apotropaic motifs and the recourse to divinatory practices as essentially triggered by, quote, events out of people's control, end quote. Eclipses, comets, earthquakes, and they cited contemporary sources that witnessed these upheavals. And while there is no doubt that extraordinary events could provide a contingent cause for people's anxieties about their safety and future and associated reactions, and this is true for the past as it is for today, this view overlooks the theoretical and philosophical discussions about divinatory and talismanic sciences flourished through the centuries, and how these reverberated in the cultural landscapes of those societies that recurred to them. As these activities are relegated to the realms of irrationality and decadence, an active contribution to the cultural production of the Islamic tradition has simply been negated to them up to this point. Remaining in the Seljuk period, just for a moment, a closer look at an authoritative 12th century text on statecraft, Nizami Aruzi's Chahar Maghala, the Four Discourses, suffices to expose one of the prevailing contemporary views related to what is arguably the most widespread yet reproached divinatory technique, astrology. In the opening passages of this influential text, we learn that, and I quote, "Of the servants essential to kings are the secretary, the poet, the astrologer, and the physician, with whom he can in no wise dispense. For the maintenance of the administration is by the secretary, the perpetuation of the immortal renown by the poet, the ordering of the affairs by the astrologer, and the health of the body by the physician," end of quote. The text goes on to list the scientific classification of each branch and activity, notably, I think, identifying mathematics as the science to which astrology/astronomy belong. And here it is worth pausing to say that the two disciplines are actually complementary disciplines. They really went hand in hand in the pre-modern, pre-rational world, so the two were not effectively separated. A good astrologer had to be a proper astronomer before being an astrologer. And then the text continues by explaining how the four discourses, the Chahar Maghala, are structured, and I here quote again. "Philosophical consideration as germane to this book will therefore be advanced at the beginning of each discourse, and thereafter 10 pleasing anecdotes of the choice connected with that subject and the rarest appropriate to that topic of what hath befallen persons of the class under discussion will be adduced, in order that it may become plainly known to the king that the secretarial office is not a trivial matter, that the poetic calling is no mean occupation, that astrology is a necessary science, and that medicine is an indispensable art," end of quote. The classification of astrology as a science is worth remarking here. To it were attributed principles, methods, purposes, meaning, and this means that before a modern notion of rational science took root, astrology was a way of knowing as valid as others. In particular, a way of knowing the universe through its signs, causes, and spirits, by uncovering the effect of the correspondences and sympathies that linked the heavenly and the earthly spheres, both of which, let's not forget, remain part of God's design. They are not external to it, so they are inevitably subject to his power and part of an Islamic worldview. The stories that follow in the Nizami's treatise provide examples of the various applications, uses, and relevance of the four roles. For astrology, these range from personal to political decisions, from entertaining tales to parables and pearls of wisdom, from information about the intellectual background necessary for its effective practice to the moderate amount of folly, that's the word that is used, similarly needed to undertake the job. Anecdotal or not, what matters, I would like to argue here, is how naturalized astrology appears in this context, in this treatise at this time, at this moment in time, not only due to the extensive space given to it in a treatise of this kind. This is a treatise of political science. It's a 12th century treatise, but it is an authoritative text. But also in virtue of the fact that its practitioners occupy the same place and importance as three more established and recognized functions: the vizier, the physician, and the poet. Their simple inclusion in a conversation of this kind indicates a lack of bias against astrology, which, as a matter of fact, emerged in a more convinced and articulated form much later, and that therefore should not be retroactively used to assess and understand experiences of the past. The exemplar making up most of the chapter about astrology in this book have the effect to reinforce the validity of this discipline and its relevance for kingship, more than providing reliable historical examples on the efficacy of prognosticative techniques, which was left as a task to the more technical literature, of which we have plenty of examples in existence. Now, how are then we to see objects as the ones on the screen? Are the astrological references contained in their wide-ranging decorative cycles mere ornamental exercises? Are they simply part of the visual repertoire of the artists and craftsmen of the time? Was this what was in fashion? Or can they speak to the relevance and importance of certain ideas and principles in the 12th century as much as in the 19th century? I would like to examine them in closer detail today to see what else we can learn about the divinatory method they constantly evoke. So we are sticking with astrology for the time being. On the screen is one of the most celebrated examples of medieval inlaid metalwork, named after its purported owner prior to its acquisition by the British Museum in 1950. The vaso vescovali is a bowl on a splayed foot, accompanied by a lid that in all likelihood was not originally part of it. Yet both lid and bowl display a rather cohesive and elaborate decoration, which is distributed in bands and roundels, featuring the 12 zodiacal signs on the body and personifications of the planets on the lid. And this includes the 8th so-called pseudo-planet, Jauzar, to which we'll come back in a moment. Significantly, the signs on the bowl are not presented according to their standard iconography, which is here exemplified by an early 13th century luster bowl, where the zodiac is illustrated with its classical symbols, which I'm sure many of you recognize. But they are presented in the form of the planets' diurnal and nocturnal domiciles, because the seventh sphere, the 7 planets, rule the zodiacal signs and inflect their properties and characteristics. The decorative programs on the body and of the body of the bowl and the lid, therefore, are somehow attuned, and both highlight the influences that the planets exert thereby referencing their expected effects on Earth and on men. Here, for instance, at the top, we recognize Sun in Leo, an image symbolizing the creative burst and optimism of this sign, while below is Mars riding Aries, so Mars in Aries, and Mars is generally depicted as a sort of warrior holding a dagger, a sword, and a severed head, evoking the associated instinctive and martial connotation. The presence of such a specific and informed imagery has been interpreted by many scholars before as designed to draw on the protective and talismanic qualities of the reference, rather than being a simple generic decorative choice. The lid of the bowl seems to underscore this as well, because it too displays personifications of the planets with a series of attributes which are symbolized by a number of objects they hold in their hands, which are considered to be direct references to their talismanic or so-called magical properties. For instance, on the top left is Mercury, the planet Mercury, whose intellectual qualities are emphasized by a scroll, a book stand. I think this is a pen box and a pen, a reed pen. At the center is Saturn, who is the only one that is generally depicted as a multi-armed sort of individual. Here holding a rat, a pickaxe, and a sickle, which are directly associated with its chthonic subterranean world, and the fact that he controls activities such as agriculture. It is important to keep in mind that because of the distance of Saturn from the Earth, it is the furthest planet to the Earth, he is generally considered a negative planet, a malefic planet, and therefore its representations or attributes are often used as talismans supposed to repel evil, because evil repels evil, essentially by the principle of similarity. Finally, on the right-hand side, we have the invisible planet, the so-called pseudo-planet Jauzahr, known also as the dragon, which is considered responsible for lunar and solar eclipses, and is also known to function as a talisman, particularly when represented as a cross-legged figure flanked, either with these two sticks with serpent or dragon heads. And there is a place in particular worth pointing out, that the appearance of this planet in the astrological cycles, in astrological decoration, occurs in that Seljuk period that we mentioned at the beginning, and more specifically in the arts of the Artukid dynasty, which was a sort of a dynasty of governors underneath Seljuk control initially, that eventually gained some political autonomy, and is found therefore particularly in their architectural decoration, in bridges, in liminal spaces, in gateways, as a form of protection, literally as a talisman to repel negative influences. Now, an in-depth and integrated analysis of objects and sites that showcase this peculiar imagery and its numerous adaptations and permutations, as well as the context of use and consumption, is clearly still lacking, as is a proper text-based understanding of what these images effectively meant at the time in this specific context. The point I'm making here is that their presence and relatively widespread use across media and space reveals some form of knowledge of astrological matters from their makers and users. You know, you have to think about those who make and those who read these images and receive these objects, and clearly some degree of belief in the associated or supposed influences within an Islamic framework. The use, at least in some context, is specific, is intentional, and designed to appeal to the influences of the heavenly spheres in ways that, however, do not seem to call into question God's power and influence, which is, at the end of the day, the principle under which also those stars function. And there is another inlaid object, also from the collection of the British Museum, which was produced in Mosul in northern Iraq during the second third of the 13th century, which helps reinforcing this point with its rare juxtaposition of planetary images which decorate the body of the casket here, with Quranic citation. The excerpt is from the 11th surah and recites, "And my success is not through Allah. Upon him I have relied, and on him and to him I return." An act of reconciliation by the craftsman, a disclaimer for the zealous one, or maybe quite simply the implicit recognition of the fact that God rules over everything, and that awareness of the universal correspondences, microcosm and microcosm, and influences is not a challenge to his unity or authority. Something to think about, of course. The idea that stars could impact men's destiny finds an even more compelling expression in the nativity book of Iskander Mirza, the grandson of the Turko-Mongol ruler Tamerlane, another celebrated work of art which was completed in Shiraz at the beginning of the 15th century. This rare document, which is a horoscope, a princely horoscope, opens with prayers to God, the heavenly bodies, the Prophet Muhammad, and a reference to the prince, to the recipient, before laying out the mathematical and astronomical calculations on which the prediction and the interpretation is based. This includes aspects such as the moment of conception of the prince and the ascendant, which in astrology is the sign of the zodiac which is rising on the eastern hemisphere at the moment of birth of the prince, which is in astrology, more important sometimes for determining one's fate than the time of birth itself. A two-page painting, which is the one that you see on the screen, which illustrates the position of the stars at the time of the prince's birth, concludes the first part of this horoscope. This is essentially how the sky looked like when the prince was born, and we'll go back to this image in more detail in a moment. Section 2 of the book contains the interpretation of the astronomical data. The court astrologer, Mahmud ibn Yahya ibn al-Hasan al-Tashi, who was responsible for the compilation, predicts, as you may expect, a long and healthy life for the prince, victories in war, but he also foresees challenges and threats to his authority. Finally, the third and final part of the horoscope forecasts events during Iskandar's subsequent years up to the age of 40, showing his fortunes changing for the worse on his 34th year of age. In truth, as history teaches, we know that the prince died at the age of 31. Horoscopes are never right. Executed by his uncle Shahrukh because he rebelled and tried to recapture Shiraz. Now, while the astronomical observations that underpin the horoscope were made after Iskander was born, and the date of birth is 25th of April, 1384, the text, the rest of the text, was completed when the prince was 27 years old in 1411. So there is a gap here. By concentrating on contemporaneous and future events, therefore, the document effectively opens a window onto the prince's ambitions and the real motivations that led him to commission the horoscope in the first place. Iskander saw himself as the heir to his grandfather Tamerlane, in spite of the fact that Tamerlane supported his older brothers. His views emerge in particular in an anonymous account of the House of Timur, which is dated 1413, where the point is made that the Timurid Empire was, quote, left as a legacy to the prince. Conscious of his strength and political recognition, a few months after the horoscope was made, Iskander conquered Isfahan, further expanding his territorial control over what is today central Iran. Iskander was a governor of Shiraz right before that. The decision to celebrate the support of the stars in an official horoscope, which is itself a privilege of kings, could thus be seen as much as a celebratory act as a way to validate and officialize his royal aspirations. And this is especially so if the increased size of 3 key planets, all associated with the kingly sphere, is considered, in particular talking about Mars, which you recognize here by now because he is the warrior with the severed head, and the dagger, Venus, which is the planet of intellectual and artistic endeavor, and that's why she's represented as a woman playing an instrument, in this case a lute, sometimes a harp. And eventually, more importantly here, the sun, which he recognized as a symbol of royalty because he's wearing a crown. Even more meaningful, however, in the painting is the half sign shift from the actual calculations about the position of these planets within the zodiacal houses. Essentially, the painter amended the data in order to put the planets in the right houses, and above all, in order to place the sun in Taurus, which was Iskandar's zodiacal sign, therefore proclaiming the full investiture of this prince by the stars. It was written in the sky that he had to become a ruler. By recurring to an illustrated and illuminated manuscript to authenticate political claims, Iskander appropriated yet another royal prerogative and powerful ideological tools, that of artistic patronage, which other equally ambitious Timurid princes were also exploiting in those same years. And we may think about Baysungur and Ibrahim Sultans and their incredible book production. Therefore, at the peak of his power, this Muslim prince, let's not forget this is a Muslim, made very clever use of the rhetorical and cultural trappings that defined royalty in this specific region at this time, in order to clearly communicate his aspirations to his peers, the likely viewers of this manuscript too. We know that manuscripts were admired and discussed in courtly gatherings, and that art patrons such as Iskander, whose record of beautiful illustrated manuscripts we have extant books that bear dedications to him, were exceptional and many, and some of this book must have surely circulated amongst those gatherings, which were attended by friends and relatives in ways that are very similar to the ways books were used in other courts. I'm thinking about 15th century England. The same very much happened in the same country, more or less at the same time. In the case of Iskander, clearly the important thing is that the fact that he recurred to astrology to seal his political claim is not only an indication of the status that this discipline held, at least at courtly level at this time, but in his case is also indicative of the sustained interest in and patronage of occult sciences in 15th century Shiraz. And there is some very important work that is being done these days by a colleague of mine, Matthew Melvin Kushki, who is about to actually publish a number of articles and books that have to do with this circle of occultists surrounding the court of Shiraz. So it's not only the interest of an individual person, he's part of a very specific cultural background at this specific moment in time. Moving on to the Safavid period, we are moving to the sort of 17th century, which is known to all of us for an extraordinary interest in fortune telling, which was linked to the fact that the Islamic millennium was approaching, the end of the world, technically, was approaching towards the end of the 16th century. And in fact, this culminated also in the production of this extraordinary genre of divinatory books, the Falname, the books of omens, on which there was a beautiful exhibition a few years ago at the Freer and Sackler Gallery in Washington. The objects that you are looking at adds an extra layer to the conversation that we have been having. The bowl belongs to a category of vessels which are known in the literature as magico-medicinal bowls. These are one of the tools utilized for spiritual healing, which was formalized in the so-called prophetic medicine, Tib an-Nabawi. And magico-medicinal bowls are believed to heal their users from a number of different illnesses through the beneficial properties of the verses they carry. Such virtues are transferred onto whatever liquid is poured into the bowls, and from there to the drinkers. Mostly drawn from the Quran, these verses, these passages, are effectively documented as having been employed for therapeutic purposes by the Prophet Muhammad himself, which is the reason why there was a whole genre of literature that developed and that systematized, gathered, and organized the various applications of the so-called Fadail al-Quran or Khawas al-Quran, the sort of the special properties, the virtues of the Quran. On our example in particular, the verses that we find inscribed are verse 255 to 156 from Surah Al-Baqarah, one of which is known as the Ayat al-Kursi, which is one of the most broadly, actually the most broadly quoted verse of the Quran for protective purposes, which is found essentially distributed in this beautiful lattice work of radiating lozenges. The Surah An-Nasr, as well as the Surah Al-Ikhlas, which proclaims God as the eternal refuge, which is very cleverly placed underneath here. Sorry that you can't see it, but there is a 4x4 magic square in which the individual words of Surah Al-Ikhlas are distributed in the cells. It is, however, to these vignettes here and to these inscriptions above them that I would like to draw your attention. You may recognize some of the signs of the zodiac, in particular Aquarius, Sagittarius, and Pisces here. And right above them, we read the names of the 12 Imams. Ali bin Muhammad al-Naqi al-Imam, Hassan al-Askari al-Imam, and so on and so forth, the 10th and 11th of the 12 Shi'i Imam. And Shi'i references are also contained inside the bowl in this area in particular, where the Nadi Ali, the prayer invoking Ali's assistance in times of grievance, is inscribed. Now, when I first look at this bowl, which is in my collection and is not on view, it will be on view at some point in a permanent display, I found this parallel between the 12 zodiacal signs and the 12 Imam rather bizarre and rather curious coincidence. And most recently, I actually spotted the very interesting inscription, the couplets here, on this page from a falname made in Iran in the late 1570s, which has been translated by Masume Farhad as follows: all those who are perfect on the path to God, they are all in the religion of the 12 Imams. Now, she has proposed that essentially astrological symbols are here being recast as Shi'i symbols, which is an interesting synthesis of astrological lore and religious insights, which speaks of the level of intricacy and sort of sophistication and synergies operating behind some of the images that we have on these objects. And it is an area that is completely unexplored, and I just thought I would sort of bring it up to show how, in a way, the presence of these images continues and gets recast as things change or as interests change. And if we thought that astrology was a medieval distraction, a thing of the past, here is one final example, which really is a day of modernity, effectively. which should make us probably reconsider this assumption. This coffee set is comprised of a lidded cup, a saucer, and a spoon. It's not only a triumph of technical ability, it's an object of incredible beauty. It's a very tiny object when you actually see it in real life, but also of ingeniousness, really. But it's also a unique lens through which to look into a very specific cultural and metaphysical world. An elaborate poem, which is distributed in these cartouches on every single element of the set, also tells us who the recipient of this set was. Fath Ali Shah Qajar, second ruler of the Qajar dynasty, an ambitious leader and a formidable patron of the arts, as we all well know. Now, in the verses that border the saucer, and I'm talking about the verses surrounding the images here, Fath Ali Shah is compared to the sun. He's acknowledged, and I quote here, as the cause of creation and the way of heaven, and celebrated as a source of cosmic order, thanks to which the 7 planet stars have attained their stability. Immediately below the verses, in these roundels here, the decorative program responds to the poem, essentially, with personifications of the planets in a sequence of roundels. So at 1 o'clock is the moon, which holds a gold disc. At 3 o'clock is Saturn, with the many arms. By now you should start recognizing some of these images which return in that fashion throughout, more or less throughout the entire visual production. At 5 o'clock is Jupiter, which is unusually represented as a young kneeling woman, and I don't know why that is the case. At 6 o'clock is Mars, holding his warlike attributes. At 8 o'clock is the Sun. At 10 o'clock is Venus, the musician. And finally, at 11 o'clock is the learned Mercury, who holds a little book, as you can see. The astral symbolism continues on the cup and the lid in both word and image form. The poetry on the cup is particularly clever, I think, in its use of puns and metaphors, because it compares the reflection of the cup's holder to a glowing moon, which is a very frequent paragon of beauty in Persian poetry throughout its entire history. And then it declares that the heavens and the zodiac are in the grasp of the sun. Imagine that Fath Ali Shah is actually holding this cup, okay, as he drinks coffee. Because by holding the cup, the ruler would symbolically have the universe in his hand. So to fulfill this vision, effectively, we have signs of the zodiac stacked on the cup and interspersed with personification of the 6 main constellations, including Cassiopeia, Perseus, Andromeda, and so forth. To emphasize Fath Ali Shah's universal authority further, the lid carries yet another set of zodiacal signs which come from the Turco-Mongol tradition, from the Chinese one. And if you are a little bit conversant in it, you may recognize the snake, the pig, the horse, which are part of the Chinese horoscope, okay? Which is probably drawn into this tradition through the extensive and continued exposure to China, most probably during the Mongol period. And I don't think that anybody has really looked into this as a potential avenue of research. Now, there is one thing that remains a bit enigmatic, and this is the central medallion which represents our Jauzahr, the pseudo-planet, dragon-like planet responsible for eclipses. Now, the confusing thing is this sort of entanglement with these 3 bodies with 2 heads, which is a very odd image, which I have not found anywhere else, and I do welcome suggestions about if you have ever seen anything like that. So the circular arrangement, the fact that these figures mutate as they go around, I don't know, maybe it evokes the passing of time. The circular arrangement maybe speaks about the cyclical nature of time, the fact that we have ideas of renewal and rejuvenation that are attached to new rulers as they come by. And if this was a way to read, let's say, this aspect of the iconography, it would be a very suitable reading for someone like Fath Ali Shah, who, after all, aspired to bring Iran back to its former glory. He was also known as the Lord of Conjunction, the Sahib-e-Quran. This is one of the titles that appear in historical narratives connected to Fath Ali Shah, to him and to other rulers. So it is, in a way, no surprise that an astrological theme was chosen for a decoration of such a personal object. The term Sahib-e-Quran, in particular, was increasingly adopted in royal titulature, starting with Tamerlane. So again, the Mongol Central Asian input in this, and called systematically for auspicious planetary conjunctions in relation to the reigns of specific individuals, which were presented themselves as the rejuvenators. The Mujaddid sometimes is another title that we often find. So added to other imperial titles and epithets, the references imbued political legitimacy and authority with cosmic, if you wish, and universal undertones. So far from indicating Fath Ali Shah's superstitious nature, as someone may be drawn to believe, I think this actually reflects the range of cultural associations that inform royal ideology in the Persianate world at this specific moment in time. And this is clearly just another concrete proof of the relevance and significance of astrological knowledge and practice in the context of an Islamic court. These few examples, which, most of which, with the exception of the Vaso Vescovadi, were exhibited in the Power and Protection exhibition, which John mentioned earlier this year, reveal the need not only to surpass modern occultophobia, and I'm borrowing this term from my occultist colleagues who are doing much more interesting work on texts in particular about this, but also to integrate objects and material evidence to the tools of historical inquiry. Significant work in this direction is currently really being done in both American and European academia. And some of the latest research, I'm happy to say, that will be presented in a volume to be published by Brill, hopefully in 2019 or 2020, which is based on a conference, on a 3-day conference that we had following towards the end of the exhibition, and that effectively will hopefully begin to reveal the extraordinary intellectual impact that occult sciences had across Muslim societies over time, and consequently also begin to alter and broaden the way we understand their worldview. Thank you very much.